Okay, regarding now cavitation and flooding, here's a quote from Paul M. McKinney in a thing he wrote called Abstract, and here's the title of his abstract. Nothing, quote unquote, which is the vacuum, can reduce everything, unquote. That's the name of it, and here's what he said. Vacuum bubbles formed within turbulent fluids, including water, possess unimaginable capability for rapidly reducing materials. Reducing material would be like eroding it, turning a big rock into sand. Evidence from constantly monitored civil engineering projects, aerodynamics, marine acoustics, design, engine design, etc., combine to witness that cavitation, unavoidable in floods, must be avoided in fluid dynamic design. Rampant cavitation explains flood sediment origins with minimum time. Laboratory tests in Stanford University demonstrate impacts as high as 350,000 pounds per square inch, resulting from shock waves initiated by the collapse of vacuum bubbles. Vacuum bubbles of a cavitation, okay, that are created by this the hydraulics, the water. I know, it's hard to picture. But the point is, just get this, that there's these vacuum bubbles created in rapidly moving water. I don't get it. That's what they call them, vacuum bubbles. But whatever it is, it happens, and the ships have to deal with this kind of thing all the time. So it's a reality. That's why I looked it up in the encyclopedia to see what it had to say about it. But he's making the application to floods and what happens in a flood and why they can be so damaging because of this thing called cavitation that occurs. And he's just making the point of the tremendous force that's created by the collapse of these vacuum bubbles. Somehow a vacuum bubble is created, but the reason you have trouble picturing it is it was a vacuum. How come it doesn't just go like that? How does it ever get that way? But it collapses, and when it collapses, it creates a force. He says they've measured 350,000 pounds per square inch. He says other investigators suggest forces as high as 30,000 atmospheres, or about 450,000 pounds per square inch. The certainty of its widespread activity in floods is beyond question, both theoretically and from observation. Ongoing cavitation during the historical flood and the breakup of the fountains of the deep would have resulted in sequential subsidence of large sections of the crust of the earth down to the exhausted fountain cavities. And remember, the scripture says that God opened up the windows of heaven and poured forth rain for 40 days and 40 nights, but it also said that the fountains of the deep broke forth and burst open and spewed out all this water. So these cavities of water underneath the crust of the earth, somehow all this under tremendous pressure broke out and burst out onto the surface. And he's saying that the flood had such a force. And remember in our discussion theologically about this in the Bible, we talked about it destroying the whole surface of the earth that then existed. Okay, what they're saying is that during the flood, the fountains of the deep would have resulted in sequential subsidence of great sections of the crust of the earth down to the exhausted fountain cavities. So the crust would have been just eroded away right down to what was this cavity where the water was. These reservoirs supported the crust prior to all being broken up in one day. Impact, electrical and thermal shock from cavitation event may make cement instantaneously, providing rapid sedimentary lithification or rock formation. Okay? So not only did the layers, the sediments be laid down quickly as a result of this vast flood, but they would have hardened quickly because of in effect, the cement that would have been created by this cavitation process and destroying the existing crust of the earth. That's what it's trying to say. I have here a definition of sedimentary rocks. Rocks deposited by water or sometimes wind. They consist of material derived from pre-existing materials, that is rock, sand, lime, mud, organic materials. Most of the Earth's crust is covered with such sediments. Okay, back to the Grand Canyon again. Not only is there evidence that the various layers of the Grand Canyon were formed quickly, but many creationists now believe the entire Grand Canyon itself was produced rapidly. Okay, now think about it. The layers that make up the canyon, the picture is that there are all these layers on an even surface, and then something caused the eroding away of this thing that we now call the canyon. So this was eroded down through the layers so that we can see the edges where it was eroded away of these various layers, a mile deep of layers. And creationists believe that that canyon itself was formed very quickly. Recent research has revealed increasing indications that the bulk of the canyon was not carved by a slow-paced erosion by the Colorado River, which runs through the canyon, which is the way it's normally portrayed. This, as I think it was Stuart Crane said, this little stream down there, this little pizziwinkle compared to the whole canyon, the little Colorado River going through the bottom of that canyon, do you think that that little river eroded away this vast place? Well, they'd have you believe that it did. It was just this stream running across the top of this area, and it gradually eroded away over millions of years, this great canyon. In fact, that little stream of water wouldn't and couldn't have done that. It's certainly not the vastness of that canyon.
Why wouldn't there be canyons all over the place?
Yeah. Why wouldn't there be canyons all over the place where all the rivers and everything are? Good point, Carol. Anyway, but we believe rather that the evidence indicates that the canyon was formed by a violent, fast-working flood condition which rapidly eroded through the sediments, which show evidence of still having been soft when it was eroded. In other words, they weren't rock hard yet. They were laid down and formed, and then as a part of the flood process, a large amount of water went through and eroded away that section, and then it hardened up in the form that we see it today. Here's a quote from the man we quoted earlier, Albert Mellert, creation researcher, who said this: a week's study, he's the guy that we quoted earlier about the Grand Canyon. He said, a week's study of the Grand Canyon, I love this, should be a good cure for evolutionary geologists, as it is a perfect example of flood geology with its paraconformities and striking parallelisms of the understrata. The whole area was obviously laid down quickly, then uplifted, and then the whole sedimentary area split open like a rotten watermelon. Also, there's an article written by Stephen Austin called The Rapid Erosion at Mount St. Helens. And in it he gives examples of the very rapid, mature appearing canyon erosion after the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And we're going to be looking at the end of this series at the Mount St. Helens video, and you'll see in it where they'll show pictures of these canyon areas that look like the ancient canyons. When you believe that something like the Grand Canyon is millions of years old, you look at this, these look like they're that old too. They look the same. Now, it's not as big as the Grand Canyon, but nevertheless, the layers that are exposed and what you see in the rock and all that just looks like old stuff, if you're inclined to think that everything you're looking at is old. But it was all formed since 1980. In fact, even less, because the video is at least 5 years old, I believe. Maybe older. So most creationists have concluded that much of the Grand Canyon was carved out in the after effects of the Great Worldwide Flood, Noah's Flood. I mean, for us, it's Noah's flood. I mean, just from a scientific standpoint, if you had a worldwide flood and you don't accept it as being Noah's flood, if you just look at it scientifically, there's evidence of a worldwide flood. And there were a lot of things going on for perhaps hundreds of years after the flood, but a lot of forces and stresses and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and things that were going on before it all settled out. And that's probably where the Grand Canyon itself was formed. We believe that Noah's flood, of course, this worldwide flood, was the greatest of all floods, a catastrophe of worldwide proportion with powerful destructive effects, as indicated by some of the figures we gave earlier. And Dr. Henry Morris, who we've read his credentials before, and if you recall, he, among other things, has a PhD in hydrology. He understands the force of water and how it works. And he understands flood geology. And he's a specialist in these areas, says that there's no doubt that a worldwide flood would be accompanied by geological upheaval, earthquakes, and massive volcanic activity. And he said this in a book he wrote called King of Creation. Anyone with the slightest understanding of the hydraulics of moving water and the hydrodynamic forces associated with it would know that a worldwide tranquil flood is about as reasonable a concept as a worldwide tranquil explosion. Okay. A lot of people get a picture of the flood being, a nice gentle rain for 40 days that happened to drop a lot of water, and then there's just this deep water for a while, and then the water subsided and everything is just back to normal. The flood utterly destroyed the earth as it then existed on the surface, down through the crust. And what we had as a result after the flood is a completely different surface of the earth than existed before. We believe that most of the Earth's geologic deposits, including the great coal layers, were the result of this year-long flood. Remember, it was a year-long. And the dramatic after effects that continued throughout the world for perhaps hundreds of years afterwards. There's scientific comments upon that we mentioned a guy earlier in our study of this, John Woodmarape. Remember that name? How could you forget that name? He wrote an article called The Antediluvian Biosphere and Its Capability of Supplying the Entire Fossil Record, in which he discusses those matters. So when you look at geology, you look at the Earth's crust and the study of geology, it testifies to catastrophe and to rapid deposits by water. Now I want to just give a kind of a list of a summary list of evidences for lines of evidence that suggest the worldwide flood as we believe it happened long ago for us being about 4,500 years ago, that involved massive amounts of water, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, turbidity currents, massive erosion, and everything else that we've been talking about. Some of this is a bit of review, but let's just list these things again to get it all in one place and to think in terms of the physical evidence for a worldwide flood that's consistent with the Bible. First, existence of extremely large numbers of fossils. I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of fossils. Fossilization requires, as we've already seen, rapid burial, yet that's not happening today. We don't see that kind of burial going on today, and fossilization is virtually non-existent in our day. The existence of massive numbers of fossils worldwide is clear evidence of a quick, deep mass burial. A global flood catastrophe would offer conditions most ideal to the formation of great numbers of fossils. Most fossils, virtually all fossils, give evidence that the animals were killed suddenly, most likely in the entombment itself causing their death. In other words, they didn't die and wait around for somebody to come along and bury them in the flood. They died as a result of being entombed, which, by the way, is evidenced in part by the fact that they have found fossils of creatures that have just been, like they've been buried alive and they've been twisting and turning, trying to fight against their entombment.
How about the, those big animals up north?
The mammoths?
Mammoths, that's it, with green vegetation.
That's the evidence of rapid death and burial, or simultaneously burial and death, has been found with these mammoths, have been found up in the ice in the northern regions of our world. And they've found these creatures with some of them with the food they were eating, the grasses still in their mouths, other grasses and flowers in their stomachs that were as yet undigested, which meant that they had to be frozen very quickly or would have digested even after they were dead. And so in this case, they were somehow frozen very rapidly as a result of the catastrophe of the flood. Which, by the way, and let me speculate about this, could have occurred as a result of the collapse of the vapor canopy. That one of the things in this list we're going to read now is the fact of an evidence all over the world of a temperate, tropical type climate all over the Earth's surface, including the poles, that previously apparently once existed, and there was not ice on the poles originally, and which could be explained by the collapse of the vapor canopy. The vapor canopy around the Earth before the flood would have created a greenhouse type of effect, and I don't mean that in the sense that today the environmentalists are talking about the greenhouse effect and the mass warming of the atmosphere. But the greenhouse effect of that vapor canopy would have caused a tropical climate all over the surface of the Earth, and when that vapor canopy collapsed in a short period of time as a result of the windows of heaven being opened up, then in the nature of things at the poles you would have had very rapid drops in temperature, rapid and massive drops in temperature, which resulted in flash freezing these animals and burying them in what would have been then snow and ice rather than just floodwaters. So that's some of the speculation on how that occurred. Okay, back to this, number one, this vast quantity of fossils and the evidence of their death and entombment all being at the same time. There's no strong evidence to the contrary of that, and in fact, there's a lot of good indicators of it. Further indicators of that bring us to the next point, that rapid fossilization has been evidenced by the preservation of delicate parts of a lot of the animals in the fossils. Thousands and millions of fish fossils which retain, or have been found, which retain all the body parts, including which indicate a very rapid burial. Under normal conditions, fish do not fossilize when they die. Dead fish are torn apart by scavengers and disintegrated by bacteria. If normally they float to the surface and they're eaten at the surface, or they sink to the bottom or eaten by bottom scavengers, and they're not fossilized. But these things are fossilized, intact, in whole, with all their body parts. Also, they found existence of fossils of such soft invertebrates as jellyfish and sponges. To fossilize those, they have to be simply buried, basically alive, because as soon as they die, they disintegrate, you know. And then also they found preservation in fossils in these fossil beds of animal tracks, fish odors. They'll break open a rock that has a fossil of a fish in it, and the stinky fish smell comes out. Dung, rain prints, mud cracks, amino acids, proteins, epidermal hairs in plants, cell details, chlorophyll, and many other things have been found, evidences of those things in the fossils, which mean these things were trapped quickly, and in the case of the living things, died as a result, and everything was captured. Another evidence is whale fossils. Huge animals like whales have been found completely fossilized, whole whales, fossilized completely, quickly buried in sediment and fossilized. And there's an article written by in Chemical and Engineering News by K.M. Reese called "Workers Find Whale in Diatomaceous Earth Quarry," on a whole whale. We discussed already the polystrate fossils. The existence of fossils like trees and shells and others extend through 2 or more layers, layers which represent millions of years apart. Again, can only happen in fact not through millions of years of slow fossilization, but only through rapid burial, all in the same flood. If part of a tree was buried and was being fossilized, the other part sticking out that wasn't buried would rot. It would decay. In fact, if you have a tree that dies out in the woods, if you don't get to it very soon, and you go to cut it down, if it's been there for a long time and use it for firewood, it's useless, because it's decayed and it's junk. Punky, yeah, that's what you call it. We also discussed the random order of fossils, that the sediments do not exhibit strong evidence of a record of evolution with this simple life forms at the bottom layers working up to the more complex life forms. Again, remember the geologic column is really kind of made up and put in a book, and it's based on their belief system, not on the observations, though yes, in some places you have generally more simple life forms in the lower layers, and generally more complex forms progressively moving up. But there is, through flood hydrology studies and sedimentation and burial of things that take place through things settling out in the sedimentation, there's evidence that less complex things will fall out first, and the more complex things will settle out later, so that it does have a tendency, in some conditions, to order itself with the less complex at the bottom layers and the more complex on the upper layers.
Things tend to be more buoyant.
Well, that's part of it. The bigger things tend to be more buoyant. When they have appendages sticking out of them, they tend not to sink as rapidly. So, but the vast majority of the record doesn't even have that kind of ordering in it. It's all mixed up in various ways. And again, that mixing up would be consistent generally with the tremendous forces of a worldwide flood. Again, the order is, you've got random order, completely upside down, out of order, all of which can be explained by the worldwide flood. Earlier I mentioned overthrust, and I said I have a quote later on for you on overthrust. There's an overthrust in Scotland called the Lewis overthrust, and it's called an overthrust because of the order of the fossils. And I don't know where I got this quote. I've had this quote so long, the edges of the pages are frayed, and I typed this on this piece of paper years ago, and somehow I don't have the source of this, but this is an interesting quote nevertheless. Whoever said this said about the overthrust in Scotland, Lewis overthrust, he said, "Had these sections been planned for the purpose of deception, they could not have been more skillfully devised, and no one coming first to this ground would suspect that what appears to be a normal stratigraphic sequence is not really so." In other words, he's saying, it really looks like it was laid down that way, but of course because of the order of things, we know it wasn't. It has to be an overthrust. Again, they will call things overthrust that are not overthrust simply because of the order of the fossils. Okay, massive sedimentation. Further evidence for the global flood, global existence of massive amounts of sediments all over the surface of the Earth. Most of the Earth's crust is covered with layer upon layer of sediment, and evidence of strong sorting action produced by moving water. Frequently, the sediment bears strong evidence of having been laid under flood conditions, where one can find dolomite, silicious iron, etc. Where can one today find dolomite, which is a layer of rock, silicious iron, etc., forming in large quantities today? You can't. It's all something that happened back then and happened under flood conditions. It's no longer happening. Another thing that's evidence of this is what's called dolostone beds. I believe dolostone relates to dolomite. The global existence of massive amounts of dolostone beds are sometimes thousands of feet thick, but dolostone is not forming today. Well, again, I'm saying I believe it's related to dolomite, which is a form of rock. It's a kind of rock. It's a lot of, they mine dolomite and they use it for calcium supplements. Of course, human body, stones, rocks are not on the normal food chain, and so the body doesn't assimilate it very well.
What do you find? Are you going to talk about mineral veins and stuff like that?
Well, somewhat here. This list right now, and these various types of layers of different minerals and rocks and stuff is going to touch on that. I confess to not knowing a lot about it, but I'll share what I do know about as we go here. Chert beds. I never heard of chert, so I looked up in the dictionary. Chert is a dark, impure mineral containing quartz and hydrated silica, resembling flint but lighter in color. Chert consists of submicroscopic crystals. Okay, the formation of the global existence of formed large chert beds up to 50 feet thick and more is evidence of flood conditions, and there's no chert being formed today. I think that some of these things exist because they precipitated out of the floodwaters into these various layers, and the precipitation of different minerals would occur at different times, creating therefore layering effects. Does that sound right, Peter, to what you know?
Yeah. Don't bet on it. You might lose your church.
Thanks, Kelly. Conglomerate. Does anybody know what conglomerate is? Conglomerate consists of cemented gravel, sand, and boulders. So you got rock layers that are made up. It looks like coarse cement sidewalks, when they make it up, they mix up cement. It's not real fine cement. They mix it up with rocks and stuff in it. Okay? That's a conglomerate. The massive existence of massive amounts of conglomerate rock indicating deposition under flood conditions over extremely wide areas with very strong currents is an observable evidence, again, of worldwide flood conditions. Greywacke. Anybody heard of greywacke? I'm learning a lot preparing for this. I had to look that one up too. Greywacke. Geology, a conglomerate of rounded pebbles and sand derived chiefly from basic igneous rocks. Okay, that's greywacke. It says the global existence of massive amounts of greywacke sandstone are evidence of worldwide flood. Very rapid deposition is implied in the existence of these greywacke layers. No greywacke sediments have been found forming today. Again, every one of these things, consistently, no longer forming. Another evidence, massive precipitations of gypsum, common salt, and anhydrite. For those who don't know what gypsum is, gypsum, a mineral used to make fertilizer and plaster of Paris. Hydrous calcium sulfate. Alabaster is one form of gypsum. And then anhydrite is a white or grayish mineral consisting of anhydrous calcium sulfate, usually granular but sometimes crystalline. Okay, so they're saying massive precipitations of gypsum, common salt, and anhydrite. Enormous, relatively pure beds of these minerals are found globally, sometimes thousands of feet thick. Have you ever heard of salt mines? They go in and mine salt. It's just pure veins of salt, just pure salt. How did it get there? And why is it there that way and in pure form? Well, a worldwide flood would explain that, as it would precipitate, the salts would precipitate out and create a layer while other things were still in solution. And that's how that's taking place with all of these things. Again, there's no clear evidence of other sediments in these things. They're pure. Some claim these beds are much easier to explain in terms of rapid precipitation in deep water than in the usual, over thousands of years, gradual laying down. How do you lay down gradually thousands of feet of salt? Fluid dynamic experiments have yielded evidence of how cyclic turbulence during a global flood might naturally produce a layering effect in the sediments. Layers of clay, sand, lime, organic material, and the like could naturally tend to be piled on top of each other in repeated patterns in very short periods as a result of massive worldwide flood. And experiments have demonstrated that. We talked about coal before, the existence of coal in enormous amounts. There's no uniformitarian theory which can adequately explain the evidence of coal as well as does the catastrophic worldwide flooding. Massive volcanism. It's really only in my studies in the last few years that it's dawned on me that there was a lot of volcanic activity at the time of the flood. That, again, with the breaking forth of the fountains of the deep, would have caused tremendous disruptions in the crust of the earth, which resulted in volcanic eruptions as well as these water fountains bursting forth. And I never thought about it before recently. But the existence of thousands of cubic miles of volcanic and granite-type rocks would be expected during a global catastrophic geologic upheaval. But even the worst volcanic eruptions today don't explain the kind of the thousands of cubic miles of granite and other things that we find that would be the result of volcanic eruption. But there's nothing that big. Even the biggest things we know of, Krakatoa and these other massive volcanic eruptions that have caused, in fact, disruption in our weather worldwide because of putting tremendous amounts of volcanic dust in the atmosphere and everything, as big as they are, they have not created these vast areas of rock that we find existing from some previous volcanic eruptions that were worldwide. Earlier I touched on the matter of the worldwide global warm climate that previously existed. Underneath the ice caps at the poles, guess what's there? Evidence of tropical life, plant life, and tropical environment. At both poles, all over the surface of the Earth, there's evidence of a previous tropical climate and the life forms that go with that. The poles didn't used to be covered with ice. Evidence of significant past global temperature changes would again be explained by a worldwide flood. With the massive volcanic releases into the atmosphere, worldwide flooding, and later great evaporation from wet continents would all create tremendous temperature fluctuations. And there's evidence of that. With the uniformitarian view of geology and then of the evolutionary, long, slow, millions and billions of year process of everything changing slowly, you wouldn't find the evidences they have of these rapid temperature changes that exist in the evidence. Here's an interesting one. Correlation of death dates by radiocarbon. Remember when we talked about radiocarbon, I said that there is a way you can use the concept of radiocarbon dating, which it has a validity if you use the right equation, a non-equilibrium equation. Well, when they do this and they use a correctly calibrated equation and form to test this, 25,000 radiocarbon dates have been graphed. And the result shows evidence of a great peak of death approximately 4,000 years ago. In other words, the vast majority of these things they've tested that they found dead all died in the neighborhood of about 4,000 years ago. Actually, it would have been about 4,500 years ago, but you're talking about things that are relatively imprecise. So that's interesting that they wouldn't just be spread out all over the place. The things that they're testing, they're finding all bulk in on the graph at about 4,000 years ago. Evidence of rapid deposition in the internal characteristics of strata sequences. Here's a quote from Stuart E. Nevins in an article called Stratigraphic Evidence of the Flood, in which he said this: "The widespread physical similarity in the order of strata in each sequence indicates that virtually identical conditions were prevalent laterally over broad areas." What we're saying is this. You find a layer here. And again, they admit it's sedimentary rock, so it got there by water. It got there by some kind of a flood. Okay? But they look at the same kind of layer thousands of miles away, and the evidence, it's identical. It's not a different flood. It's not different conditions. It's all the same conditions. That's what he's saying. He says sandstones and conglomerates, which form the basal and best preserved parts of many sequences, indicate that widespread flood conditions once prevailed. Sequences are often thousands of feet in thickness, with the coarsest material at the base progressively decreasing in coarseness toward the top in the conglomerates. Now that's a little different than these organisms that might settle out with the simpler life forms at the bottom and the more complex at the top. When you've got things like sand and different sizes of rocks, the heavy ones settle out first. And the fine sand will be the last thing to settle out, the silt. And that's worldwide evidence that this is all laid by the same flood because of the way it's all the same everywhere, these conglomerates. Here's another one. Mountains uplifted after most sedimentation took place is evidence of a worldwide flood. The mountains which we have today, you go up on the top of these mountains, and guess what they find up on the top of the mountains? They find sedimentary rocks with marine fossils in them. Okay? Quote from Stuart Nevins again. On that point, he said, many mountain ranges can be shown to have been uplifted after nearly all of the stratigraphic record was deposited. In other words, how long does it take for mountains to become mountains in the evolutionary and normal evolutionary geology? Millions, maybe billions of years, right? But all these fossil beds were laid, and then these things were uplifted, because they're all up there. And again, that you got a problem with the mountains forming after all this stuff has been laid down. Even if you took their view, it's a problem. Or it is a problem when you take their view. Another one, underfit or undersized streams and rivers. Okay. The evidence is that most natural drainage systems globally at one time drained off far larger amounts of water. There are people that don't just look at the little stream of water going by or the Mississippi River when they're really serious into studying it, and they look at how it all lays out, and they realize that this stream of water, whether it's a small stream or whether it's a big river like the Mississippi, that it's a part of a much larger system of drainage, which used to drain off far larger amounts of water. And again, the evidence of the result of the flood and subsiding, etc., is there. Massive rapid erosion, again, as we touched on, such places as the Grand Canyon. Stuart Nevins, again, in his article called Stratigraphic Evidence of the Flood, goes into all kinds of evidence in that regard. The existence of great plunge pools. I never heard of plunge pools either. I can't believe how much I've learned preparing for this. Plunge pools are created as torrents of flood water and mud plunged off the continents into what are now the oceans. And apparently they're consistently all around the edges of the continents, these plunge pools, indicating massive amounts of receding water. The existence of submarine canyons. The Grand Canyon is Pizziwinkle compared to the canyons that are underneath the oceans. And the way they are there, you just picture, millions of years of oceans and things gradually happening, settling out and all the different things happen. It doesn't explain it. These huge mountain ranges and canyons underneath the oceans, deep in the oceans, are evidence that would signify the worldwide flood.
They say some kind of underwater stream washed away.
Yeah, an underwater stream washed away and eroded away those great canyons. I don't know what they say. I doubt if they say that. Enclosed lake basins, evidence of formerly huge inland lakes and seas on all continents that dried up as the floodwaters receded over the centuries, are, again, more readily explained by a worldwide flood, not by anything else. Water lines found on the coast of every continent. When there's a flood, comes in, floods your basement, there's a line on your wall. All the continents have water lines. You and I might know that. Some people study these things, discovered consistent water lines from high water levels that are not just spotty here and there, that they're apparently consistent worldwide. Water lines. I don't know any more than I've just told you. Well, but when it's settling out, it's kind of like, you're taking a bath, and you're not aware of a ring, but then as it drains out, all of a sudden there's a spot where you get a real serious ring in the bathtub, from this as it drains out. I don't know. When the water is first settling out, it probably doesn't leave the same kind of marks it does in the latter stages of the settling out. I gather is probably what it has to do with. And then finally in this list is the evidence from studies of smaller scale catastrophes, such as Mount St. Helens, modern floods, modern serious floods, volcanic eruptions such as Krakatoa and Mount St. Helens, tsunamis, turbidity currents, ocean waves, etc. That show the forces of nature that are involved and what they're capable of producing in terms of rapid and significant geologic changes. Again, are small microcosms of the larger whole, which point us in the direction of a worldwide flood, again, as far as the explanation of the evidence we see out in the world. Here's another interesting thing. This doesn't in itself prove anything absolutely, but it's kind of presumptive evidence to the fact of a universal worldwide flood. Almost all ancient peoples. Okay, now by ancient peoples, we're talking about not ancient as in millions of years ago. We're talking about peoples from thousands of years ago, and even up to today where you find people that they call primitive. That, by the way, is a totally evolutionary concept. You'll find a group of people, natives in the jungle, and they're called primitive. The idea is that they have not developed as far as others of us have. The truth of the matter, most of the primitive peoples that you find living in the jungles, and they're just a mess, you know. They're not primitive, they're degraded. There's a bunch of evidence that some of the so-called primitive tribes in South America came from the once very highly developed people, and I don't mean developed as an evolutionary development, but I mean social and technological development and even moral development of the, or condition rather, not development, that's not the right word, the condition of the Mayan peoples, for example. And now the remnants of the Mayan peoples, after their society collapsed when they allowed immorality and everything else to run rampant, and everything went down the drain, and those societies and groups of people just seemed to vanish. The Indians, a lot of the Indians in South America today are the descendants of those Mayans, and they are in a degraded condition. They came from a better condition down to their lower condition, so they're not primitive. But when they get into these jungle tribes of people and all, almost all of them, even today when they find them, have in their history, in their storytelling of the past, they all have stories of a great worldwide flood. Now, if in fact, and I don't put that as the possibility that it didn't happen, but I'm saying first-class conditional clause. If in fact a worldwide flood catastrophe took place, and it did, and all of the subsequent humans that exist on Earth came out of those few survivors, which we know biblically to be 8, then everybody on Earth traces their family heritage back to the same group of people that survived that flood and knew about it. And that being the case, you would expect to find in the records or in the traditions and histories of these peoples, even though it might be in a degraded form, you know, as things are passed along over the centuries, it might lose something, but you would expect to find some account in all of these of this great catastrophe. And indeed, that's exactly what they find. Anthropologists have collected at least 59 flood legends from the Aborigines of North America, 46 flood legends from Central and South America, 31 from Europe, 17 from the Middle East, 23 from Asia, and 37 from the South Sea Islands and Australia. And all of them agree on 3 things. They all have varying details that are not the same. You know, and again, that can be explained by people adding and subtracting and doing all kinds of things with the stories over the years, but they all agree on 3 points. 1, a worldwide flood destroyed both man and animals. 2, there was a vessel of safety provided for those few survivors. 3, an extremely small remnant of people thus survived and started life all over again all over the earth. They all agree on that. Now again, that doesn't prove a worldwide flood, but it's sure strong evidence to that possibility. Okay, we're just about entirely out of time. Let's see if I can quickly sum up, give the bottom line on this whole matter of the fossil record, and next week we'll start into the matter of the so-called missing links in human evolution. Where did man come from? Okay? The bottom line on the fossil record, all the different kinds of animals appear abruptly and fully functional in the layers with no proof of macroevolutionary ancestors. At the very least, this is a strong indication that not all life evolved from a common ancestor. Next, there's no scientific proof that life has ever evolved. Next, although scientists will continue to discover new varieties of fossil animals and plants, it's generally agreed that the millions of fossils already discovered and the sediments already explored provide a generally reliable indication of which way the evidence is going. Remember, some of the guys said, we're never going to find what we want. That is, there will continue to be little or no fossil evidence found to support evolution in any way. Next, most fossil animals and plants were buried in water-laid sediments. Next, there is no scientific proof that fossils, the coal, or the earth are billions of years old. None. There's no evidence to that. There is increasing evidence that many sedimentary rocks, which some thought took thousands of millions of years to accumulate, almost certainly were deposited in only months, days, or hours. And finally, in almost all cases, the very existence of the fossils and the types and numbers discovered strongly indicate a catastrophic condition, catastrophic conditions were involved in the burial and preservation of the animals and plant remains, And without such conditions, there seems to be no plausible way to explain their existence. Okay, when we get next week into the fossil men, it has something to do with fossils more, but it's not per se that. I'm just going to debunk the so-called fossil men and the missing links. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for what you've shown us tonight, and again, the abundant evidence to the truth of your word and to the lie of the evolutionary interpretation of the fossil record.